Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us for tonight's discussion. My name is Craig Kafura. I'm the Director for Public Opinion and Foreign Policy here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. I'm very much delighted to welcome Congressman Krishnamoorthi to our stage once again. The Council strives to bring people together to foster a deeper understanding of global affairs. And tonight we're going to discuss some of the work the Congressman has been doing as ranking member of the Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. Representative Krishnamoorthi was elected to Congress in 2016 and is now in his fourth term, representing Illinois' 8th District. He is the first South Asian American to lead a congressional committee and also serves on House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and the Committee on Oversight and Accountability. And before being elected to Congress, he worked on a range of issues in law, public service, and the private sector, including corruption, affordable housing, and renewable energy.
Fighting corruption.
Fighting corruption. That's true. We should clarify. This is Illinois. So we're going to start today's program off with a fireside chat, after which we'll have some time for Q&A. Finally, before we begin, I do want to remind everyone that this evening's program is on the record, but that views expressed by speakers we host here at the Council are their own and do not reflect institutional positions of the Council. Please give me a hand in welcoming the Congressman to the stage.
Thank you.
It's great to see you back on the stage, this time in person. The last time we spoke, we were in the middle of Balloon Gate. So it's nice to see you at a more calm time, I think, in U.S.-China relations.
That's right. I think we were Zooming well, so this is great.
Yeah, it's good to have you here in person.
And you know, I was an emerging leader.
Yes,
at the Chicago
long
Council.
Ties to the Chicago Council here.
I'm still emerging, but I'm really grateful to the Council for having this program. I think I was in the first class of the program, and now it's had maybe 14 or something like that, 14 classes. So anyway, thank you so much for having me back.
Fantastic. I think our director for the Emerging Leaders Program is here tonight. She'll probably grab you afterwards to chat you up.
Great.
But let's start from the top. So you are on the Select Committee for strategic competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. That's a very specific name.
Yeah.
Can you tell us just in very broad terms the origins of the committee, some of the work you've been doing there, and why that name specifically?
It's about as long as my name, so I felt very much at home to be a ranking member of this committee. So, it was negotiated, like many things in Congress. I think that there are different elements of that name. One is it's a select committee, meaning that it was stood up for a certain period of time. It's not a permanent committee. Secondly, it's about the strategic competition between the two countries. It's not about how do we win a conflict, how do we win a war, how do we vanquish the other side. It's about how do we win a competition. And I think that the last element of this that you might pay attention to is that it's really between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. It's not with the Chinese people, it's not with Chinese origin people or Asian origin people. And that's very important because, as some of my colleagues on the other side like to say, the victims of the Chinese Communist people are the people of China. And so the CCP is really where we want to direct most of our attention.
Fantastic. And just recently, the committee put out a new report on the U.S.-China economic relationship with the header of Reset, Prevent, and Build, where you thought through a couple different pillars of a new policy that you want to set out. Do you want to give us a brief overview of that report's sort of core findings?
Sure. So I think that the charge of the committee, as you saw in the legislation, was assess the economic, technological, and military risks associated with this competition and assess them and then figure out what do you do about them. And so we've put out different reports and legislation accompanying each of those three different issues. But the economic aspect of it is maybe the thorniest or the hardest to kind of tackle. And so this particular report was like painstakingly negotiated, like literally every word. And we basically came up with a report that said three things. One, we have to reset the trading relationship between the US and China because the WTO terms don't apply anymore. They haven't applied for years because At some point, it was determined that China basically decided it was going to violate numerous aspects of the WTO trading framework. We then took countermeasures. And so now we're kind of out of the WTO. And so we have to recognize that reality and then kind of reset the terms of the trading relationship. So that's the first part, the reset part. The prevent part is, how do we make sure that our technology and our capital is not somehow going to be used against us in this sense? For years, we've been exporting certain technology, whether it's high-end semiconductors or whether it's investments by private equity funds or venture capital funds in companies in China that are either perpetrating human rights abuses or helping to modernize the PLA at our risk from a national security perspective.
Congressman Raja, you are funding a genocide in Palestine.
Oh, wait a minute.
You are funding a genocide. You can.
Now back to our regularly scheduled programming. I didn't expect to have Palestinian protesting. So, all right, where were we?
Something about prevent.
Okay, I think we're on the second pillar of this report.
Right.
So we talked about resetting and then preventing.
Can I talk about, let me just say one thing, which is the other day, just 2 days ago, we actually commemorated the 35th anniversary of Tiananmen Square and the massacre that happened there. And a group of protesters showed up and basically tried to shout us down for doing that. And I was asked about that, and I said, you know what? Thank God that people can be able to do that in our country. And so,
Thank you.
you're welcome. Whether you are in Hong Kong, Tibet, Xinjiang, or you're a dissident of any stripe, you do not have that privilege. You don't have that ability to speak your mind anywhere. And so I'm glad that we are in a place where people can speak their minds, and I welcome that. I just think that there's a way to do it, and a manner in which we can have a productive dialogue. In terms of the prevent aspect of this report, it's really about preventing our capital and our technology from being used to perpetrate human rights abuses or to build up the PLA. The last part, let me just spend 1 second on that. That's about the build. That's the part that we have not spent enough time as a country on, which is how do we become the best version of ourselves in the competition between the US and China? This is not just about somehow setting another country back or taking defensive measures, but we need to go on offense, if you will. We need to fix our legal immigration system, which is totally messed up, which hinders our ability to attract and retain the very best and brightest people to innovate in technologies of the future. We have to invest in those technologies, of course, whether it's basic science and research. And then, one of the things that we have to do is we have to upgrade the skills of our own workforce to make sure that they can participate in nanoscale manufacturing or in artificial intelligence or those critical technologies that are going to determine, who is going to prevail in this competition.
There's a lot in there to talk about, and there's a lot in the full report if you ever want to go read it. Let's start with...
cure for insomnia, my friend. Just be
I
careful.
had a great time reading this on an airplane last week. Let's start with that first pillar about sort of resetting the U.S.-China economic relationship. So if we're resetting, where do we want to get to? Like, what should that relationship look like if we're outside the bounds of the WTO system?
It has to be a level playing field. What do I mean by that? Look, I am convinced now, having dealt with I was a small business person before I came to Congress. I like to say I signed the front of the check and the back of the check. I know that our businesses can compete with anyone in the world as long as they are on a level playing field. Right now, unfortunately, that is not the case with regard to China. There are at least 3 things that the CCP does in its economy that really hurt us when we compete with them. One, they steal intellectual property left and right. And it's on an industrial scale. It's not just onesie, twosie types of things. This is something that is almost commanded by the CCP. At the same time that they do intelligence gathering around the world, they're also conducting industrial espionage. The second thing that they do is they dump goods all over the world. Their playbook is very simple, which is they want to create jobs in China. So they just make stuff far beyond what their internal demand would actually dictate for purposes of their own population. And what they do is they export all that additional stuff to the rest of the world at cut rate prices to undercut their competition. And they've been doing it from consumer goods and electronics to steel and aluminum to now potentially electric vehicles. Okay? And then another thing that they do, which is very disturbing and something I hear from my constituents all the time, is the cyber attacks. Constant cyber attacks. Again, they've done this on such a scale that they actually commission cyber gangs to work with the CCP to basically not only steal intellectual property and get access to sensitive national security secrets, but also to go after your personal identity and then to do all kinds of things fraudulently with that. That's got to stop. It's just all those things and more. The state subsidies have got to stop, because if they don't, we're not going to be in a situation where we go back to WTO. And so as long as they do that, we're going to adopt countermeasures. Mm-hmm. And if they reduce the aggression, we'll reduce the countermeasures. And that's kind of where we're at.
So some of those countermeasures we've seen recently from the administration have been on electric vehicles or battery manufacturing. And this sort of fits into what the administration likes to call this small yard, high fence,
right,
where they put up very large barriers to trade on very limited number of products. Though I will note the number of products seems to grow every few months. Right? Semiconductors, now we're to EVs.
The yard's getting a little bigger.
The yard's getting a little bigger. Might put an addition on the house. How large of a yard, how high of a fence do you want to see? Like, are there other areas that we haven't touched yet that you think are critical to national security, or does defense need to be higher on some of the areas where we do have tariffs already?
Perhaps both, unfortunately. I think so far the administration, I think, has done an excellent job with regard to, for instance, artificial intelligence, semiconductor controls, even their investment controls with regard to private equity and venture capital funds. However, there are a couple areas where I respectfully submit, and my colleagues would agree with me, we need to look at a little closer. One is, for instance, passive investments, not just active investments from private equity and venture capital. We're seeing billions and billions of dollars in mutual funds. I mean, stuff that you and I would invest in that are going into some of these very problematic investments in China. Even companies that are on blacklists otherwise for purposes of other parts of the government doing business with them. We're investing in them actively. So that's one thing on the investment controls. With regard to the sectors or the areas that I think we have to look at biotech, and I've got legislation on that specifically. We're seeing, unfortunately, the same thing happen in biotech that we did with regard to some other technologies, where basically we are helping to fuel with federal tax dollars certain companies that are engaged in perpetrating human rights abuses or modernizing the PLA. The other,
talk about the
also fintech.
that you are funding as a Congress. Fund a freaking
Okay. So, funding the PLA and modernizing the PLA. We're talking about biotech, I think.
Right.
Okay.
Well, we were talking about that, biotech, yes. No, the other part of it was, I think fintech is another area that we have to look at as well.
All right. So, one of the complicating factors when we talk about U.S. and Chinese investment is sometimes we have Chinese firms that are investing in the U.S., building some of these more advanced technologies here in the U.S. So one example would be out in Manteno, there's supposed to be this battery manufacturing plant from Goshen, a couple $2 billion of investment, provide a couple thousand jobs in the U.S., but at the same time, this is a higher tech product. There's a Chinese firm involved, there's Chinese money. How does this is getting to be a complicated topic, right? Should Illinois be pursuing more opportunities like this from Chinese firms? Is this the kind of thing we should be pushing out of the US and saying, no, we're not going to allow Chinese investment? Like, where do we draw the line on some of these?
So I think that electric vehicles, for instance, is an area where, unfortunately, the CCP does own most of the supply chain right now, or a lot of it, I should say. Not just, I shouldn't say CCP, but companies that are based in China. And so this is an area where if we are going to catch up in the EV race, so to speak, we're going to have to do two things. One, we're probably going to have to partner with certain firms that are based in China in order to learn from their best practices, and then we're going to have to innovate. You have to do both. And so I think that I can understand why Ford, for instance, is partnering with, it's called CATL. It's kind of a strange name, but CATL, CATL, which is a large battery company to basically create enough batteries so that they can have enough EVs to grow at scale. But eventually their plan is they need to innovate here. And similarly, with regard to Goshen, I think we're going to see more competitors develop in Illinois and elsewhere. But first, we have to learn.
So the other, of course, big issue that I think that we've seen take the national stage with regard to Chinese companies has been ByteDance and TikTok. Now,
TikTok,
I
that?
am not a TikTok user myself. I am a little too old, I think. But it's very popular in the US. We've got something like 170 million users. What are the national security interests at play here when we talk about TikTok?
I think that TikTok presents kind of a unique issue, which is that TikTok is owned by a company called ByteDance. ByteDance is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. The editor-in-chief of ByteDance is the secretary of the CCP cell that's embedded in ByteDance to control the operations of the company. And to make sure that all of its products and platforms adhere to, quote, correct political direction. And so what we're really concerned about is that under the national security laws of China, essentially the CCP has at its access the personal data of not only people in China who use the equivalent of TikTok in China called Douyin, but the users of TikTok worldwide, including in the US. And so because of that, we entered into discussions with TikTok years ago to try to mitigate the risks, the national security risks with regard to the access to data. And so they came up with something called Project Texas. Mm-hmm. Project Texas was intended to help preserve the governance of TikTok while mitigating the national security threat. But over time, it didn't work. And the CEO of TikTok came to Capitol Hill repeatedly and made misrepresentations about that data security. He made two in particular that really rattled people. One is that he said nobody in China could access this data of Americans, that it would be somehow stored here. That turned out not to be true. Not only was it routinely accessed, but it was done unbeknownst to employees of TikTok USA. The second is that they said that none of this data would ever be weaponized against Americans. And that turned out to be true. And in a highly publicized case, not only was it weaponized against journalists, American journalists who were covering the first problem that I talked about, which is that people in China could routinely access this data. And so after that happened, nobody believed a word of what TikTok or ByteDance said on Capitol Hill. And so then we had to take other measures.
Well, we'll see how the TikTok saga unfolds in the next couple months, I guess.
We'll prevail.
Yeah, Congress doesn't like it when you lie to them. I've noticed that over the years. So earlier on, we were talking about some of the things we need to do here at home. One of the things you mentioned was sort of this race for global talent. We obviously have a lot of international students here in Illinois. A lot of them come from China to study STEM issues, medicine, engineering, the sciences. How can we make sure that they feel welcome here in the U.S.
Right.
and are welcome to stay in the U.S. even while there's this backdrop of increased competition between the US and China?
First of all, I go back to what I said at the beginning, which is it was very important for the committee at the outset on a bipartisan basis to make it clear that we can't engage in any xenophobia or stereotyping or kind of anti-Asian hate, which unfortunately has marked some of the rhetoric about China in the past. Secondly, unfortunately, there's something called transnational repression, which is happening even here in the US, where students from China are often extorted based on their relations in China, where basically someone sends a WeChat to them saying, they show a picture of their parents and saying, oh, your parents are doing really well. And we hope that you will do the right thing. And what that right thing is actually the wrong thing. It's usually some crime, it's some illegal act, it's harassing other students who might be critical of China, it might be stealing intellectual property from a professor or an inventor that they want to use or replicate back in China. Basically trying to do to people here, trying to get them to do things that they might not otherwise do. So what we have to do is two things. One, we should always be a welcoming country for the best and the brightest, regardless of where they come from, including from China. In fact, some of those best and brightest and those folks are fleeing persecution, so we should welcome them, okay? Secondly, we got to protect them when they're here. There's so many, for instance, at University of Illinois, who are kind of vulnerable to that transnational repression that I'm talking about that we need to deal with. And so we've been in active talks with administrators to do just that.
And it gets back to what you said at the beginning about the victims being the people rather than other groups. I do want to remind everyone, in case this is the first council program you've been to in a bit, for Q&A, we use our website, ccga.live. If you type that into your browser, you'll get a page. You can submit questions to me, and I'll pick the best questions. You can also vote on other people's questions if you have strong preferences. And I'll start going to Q&A in about 5 minutes. So get your thinking caps on, pull out your phone. Maybe don't go to TikTok, go to ccga.live. So before we head to Q&A, I want to pull back a bit because we've gotten into some very specific issues. So there was a really interesting roundtable recently in Foreign Affairs. So if anyone here has read this, I apologize for the summary. But this is a roundtable based around this article from one of your former colleagues, Congressman Gallagher, and Matt Pottinger, who's Deputy National Security Advisor for the Trump administration, where they argued that the U.S. shouldn't manage the competition with China, and I'm quoting, it should win it, and that they should embrace a new Cold War with China. This has led to a roundtable of critiques from people who don't think this is a reasonable policy. I'm not going to tip my hand on that one. But what's your take on this debate? So what is the appropriate end goal for this strategic competition that we've engaged in?
So I have a visual, actually, which I want to show all of you.
Raja,
Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to say I think you should be a little bit more worried about the $150 million that are
So in a recent poll of Americans, and a national survey, a majority of voters said that they believe that there was a 50-50 chance or greater of a war developing between the US and China. And it's one of their greatest fears. And in that same poll, 80% of all voters, almost 80%, said that we should do everything in our power in government to avert war with China. And so you might be wondering who's that 22%. I'm not really sure. But 80% roughly say, these are Republicans, Democrats, Independents. It's crystal clear what we have to do. And that's, to me, the central mission long term. But beyond that, we have to stabilize the relationship. We have to protect our interests. And then we have to, as I said, we have to win the competition. Okay? My concern about what Mike Gallagher is a very good friend of mine, and he was the chairman while I was ranking member. And so we developed a very good partnership. But what I don't necessarily like about this Cold War mentality is that it basically precludes the possibility of cooperation on certain fronts, and it unnecessarily elevates the rhetoric, which backs us into a corner. We don't want to get into that type of situation because we are, unfortunately, in a situation of flashpoints, whether it's in the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea. And it just takes one hothead to violate that central commandment that's on that slide, which is avoid war with China. We don't have to go to war with China, but what we do have to do is we have to deter conflict and win the competition.
So I remember seeing that polling when it came out, and this is sort of what I spend all of my time doing. I was really surprised because we've seen in our polls growing concern about China, growing concern about China's military strength, but still a really strong interest from the American public in, standing more on the side of avoiding conflict rather than preparing for war, which I thought was really interesting.
I think, fundamentally, here's the thing, which is that I think there are people in China who are kind of equally kind of riled up and ready to potentially go to conflict. Okay? And right now, the Chinese economy is tanking. I don't care what they publish for public consumption, but the economy is tanking. I think Xi Jinping is at an inflection point with regard to what to do. On the one hand, he can repair his economy, he can lower tensions, he can engage the U.S. and his neighbors in a constructive fashion to try to help repair the Chinese economy. Or he can go the other route, which is increase aggression, keep the control which he currently has on all levers of policy and decision-making in China, and then if all else fails, kind of seize the nationalist flag and potentially go for it in Taiwan or elsewhere. We don't want to encourage the latter, even at the same time that we're protecting our interests and we believe in deterring conflict.
So I've got some great questions coming in here. Thank you all for submitting them.
Congressman Raja, I want to know why.
So here is, how is the transition from Taiwanese semiconductor production to domestic U.S. semiconductor production, is that going to affect the U.S.-Taiwan security relationship? Or is that security relationship sort of regardless of the semiconductor issue?
So I think that what's really important is that this is okay. This is how it is at my home, so I'm good. I'm used to this. So look, this is the issue, which is that with regard to Taiwan, Taiwan is an incredibly resilient and robust economy. I hope that everyone here, at some point, you have a chance to visit Taiwan. I've been there twice in the last 2 years, including once on a little-noticed voyage by a certain speaker, Nancy Pelosi, to Taiwan. And what I learned is this: they produce 90% of the world's advanced semiconductor chips. 90%. This island of 22 million people. And they are an absolutely essential part of the global economy, as we learned during the pandemic and during the lockdowns, the economic lockdowns. What we have to do is we're trying to incentivize more production of those chips here in the United States, we're not going to be able to do everything that Taiwan is doing now, although we're going to get our fair share of chip manufacturing, including by TSMC, the Taiwanese semiconductor maker who's investing in the US. But what we're doing is we're diversifying our risk. We're de-risking the situation as much as we possibly can in light of what we know about China's designs on Taiwan. I think that our security situation with Taiwan, our relationship is going to continue to be very strong because regardless of what happens in semiconductor manufacturing, China's always it's got its eye on Taiwan. And Xi Jinping has said by 2027, he wants the People's Liberation Army to be ready to successfully invade Taiwan. And we have to take him at his word that he at least wants to be ready. Whether or not he does it, that's where our decision making will be crucial because we want him to say, not today. When 2027 rolls around, we want him to say, not today, not today, not today, for years.
You'll have to share your Taiwan travel tips. I have a trip this July coming up, and I'm really excited for my first time out there.
Absolutely.
So here's a question here about, you mentioned there are issues that we do want to work with China on. One of the big ones is climate change. The US and China are two of the largest generators of carbon and pollutants in the world. What ways can the US and China work together on something like climate?
It's a great question. And I think the Biden administration has found that, at least initially when it started the conversation with the Chinese with regard to the climate, it appeared as though the Chinese would only be willing to cooperate with us on climate issues if we gave in on some other issue, if we made concessions on maybe trade issues or something else. Interestingly, as of late, it appears that they are starting to play ball, even on the climate issues, just for their own sake. I'm not sure exactly why, except I think part of it is I think they recognize that, for instance, they themselves are trying to occupy the commanding heights of the renewable energy industry, so to speak. And so for them to do that, they should also have robust goals internally for reducing greenhouse gases. And that will help that industry prosper in the process and be able to supply renewable energy products to the rest of the world.
And of course, China has its own interest in avoiding some of the really catastrophic climate outcomes.
Yes.
They don't have the benefit of the Great Lakes with 20% of the world's fresh water. They have a lot less arable land available. They've had lots of problems with pollution and air pollution, and they've got their own issues too. A great question here. We talked earlier briefly about working with U.S. allies and partners around the world. And this question is, to compete with China, do we need closer ties to our allies? TPP would have been one way to do that, but with TPP sort of in the rearview mirror, what are the other ways that the U.S. can work with allies around the region, or maybe even in Europe or other parts of the world?
Absolutely. We have to do this. This is the one thing, I mean, among numerous others, but this is one thing that the CCP desperately fears, which is that the U.S., along with its friends, partners, and allies, set the quote-unquote international rules of the road with regard to how you conduct your economy, how you conduct your affairs with other countries. For instance, you don't invade sovereign nations. They don't want a situation where these rules of the road kind of become the norm because they want to set the norms. And so we have to bind together even closer with these folks. Now, with regard to trade, I think we're going to have to probably do a second look, so to speak, with regard to bilateral trading ties, maybe multilateral trading relationships, although it's challenging in the current political environment, but it's possible, as we saw with USMCA.
Mm-hmm. If it gives you any comfort, council polling suggests that trade in general is very popular with the American public, especially ideas of friendshoring, where we bring some of that manufacturing capacity, even if it's not in the U.S., maybe it's in Germany or Japan, maybe those companies are investing here. All possible.
The idea of trusted kind of relationships, trusted trading relationships, I think could develop. As you know, there's something called politics, and that kind of comes into the picture in Washington, D.C., people are concerned that you're going to have trusted trading relationships in this sector, but on, for instance, agriculture, there we're not going to trust American products, and so forth. So it's kind of a delicate dance where you kind of have to bring everyone along at the same time.
Good reminder that everybody's got politics.
Yeah.
So here's a question more specifically on the concerns about passive investing. If there's already a blacklist that mutual fund managers need to abide by, is this just a question of enforcing existing rules, or do we need new additional legislation to deal with some of these problems?
So interestingly, under the current rules, you are allowed to invest in those companies that might appear on a blacklist. So just as an example, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, if you manufacture goods in Xinjiang province in China, there's a presumption that you are using slave labor under our laws. So you get put on what's called the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act entity list. The federal government is not allowed to purchase goods or services from those companies. We may not be able to export certain technology, but you are allowed to invest in them. So you need to be able to have new rules, legislation in place to kind of prevent that. In addition, although the Biden executive order is excellent, it's an executive order, so it can change depending on the administration.
So one of the areas where Xinjiang comes up a lot is clothing, because it's a heavy cotton producing area. And of course, one of the hot new things in the US is shipping from Shein and Temu.
Right.
Are there plans for the committee to address some of the way that they get around current shipping standards for the US? Because it seems like a lot of that's flying under the radar at the moment.
Right. There's something called the de minimis loophole. I'll just step back for a second. Almost everything that you order online, if it comes from a foreign country and it's above a certain value, it's $800, by the way. If it's over $800, that gets usually inspected by Customs and Border Patrol, and there's tariffs, depending on which country it comes from. We have something called the de minimis loophole, which is if something comes under the $800 threshold, not only is it not inspected as closely by Customs and Border Patrol, it's not tariffed. And so guess what? Shein and Temu figured this out a long time ago, and their whole business model is premised on the de minimis loophole. And so you're having literally millions of packages now flowing across the border from Shein and Temu, direct to your residence, that hasn't been inspected by CBP, and that puts your brick and mortar stores at a distinct disadvantage. So when you combine all those things, the answer is yes, we have to kind of reform that legislation.
Well, Congressman, we are at time. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Could I please have, I know. I've been told we have to end at 45 after, Congressman. I'm sure your schedule is packed if it's anything like.
I have to get to the northern suburbs, so I really apologize. Good luck to me, but thank you again.
Round of applause, please.
Thank you.